Hi, I'm Finn, and in this Sociology Explained video, I'm going to be running through new right perspectives on the role and function of education. So this is part of the AQA A Level Sociology course, and that first section of the course where you need to understand different perspectives on the role and function of the education system. And this, I'll be doing this by running through this set of notes here that are available on the Sociology Explained website, where you can also find essay plans and essay writing advice. So if you find the video helpful and the notes helpful, you can download them by going onto the Sociology Explained website. We'll start off by thinking a little about who the New Right are and what it means as a theory. The New Right is a kind of intellectual movement that emerged in the 1970s, and it was a response to the kind of economic instability of that time, and it was largely a rejection of the welfare state that had emerged after the Second World War. It was particularly influential in the UK and America, and it is sort of symbolised by the election of Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US, who were both sort of New Right politicians who advocated for the New Right's fundamental idea, which is that the state should play a sort of minimal role in society, and the free market should be allowed to flourish. New Right commentators on education maintain this broad idea that education should operate within the free market. And they also believe that the state should not be as active, and it shouldn't be propping up schools that are underperforming, and instead it should let kind of market forces take over. And if a school is underperforming, that school should therefore close, as it's a sign of failure, and that it's not working for the students and the parents who need it. They also argue that the school should prepare students for the capitalist workforce, and that it should promote the values of a country. The first key New Right scholars are Chubb and Moe, who wrote in 1990 Politics, Markets and American Schools. And this text was based on a comparison of 60,000 pupils from low-income families in over 1,000 state schools and private schools, and they also developed a survey for parents. This was in America, and their main argument was that American schools were failing because the state continued to give failing schools money even when they had an inadequate grip on behaviour and they had poor academic results. They argued that private schools were doing better because they had to respond to consumer demands. Because they were competing for customers in their parents, it meant, according to Chubb and Moe, that they had to make sure they had a grip on these things, otherwise they would lose business. Whereas the state schools could fail in these ways, but it wouldn't matter because everyone would keep their jobs and the state would still fund the school. So they identified two particular groups that this was failing. They said it was failing boys and SEN students in particular, and they argued that state schools were over bureaucratic. This meant that they were inflexible to provide tailored support to students that needed it. They argued that education should be placed in the free market, so introducing competition to education to encourage schools to drive up their performance. They advocated for a voucher system, which is where parents would all have vouchers that they could spend at the school of their choice. So this meant that instead of the state deciding which schools got money based on how many pupils they have, parents would all have education vouchers they could spend at the school they wanted to. So this would ensure that, according to Chubb and Moe, the best schools would get the best money, and the worst schools will get the least, which would encourage all schools to perform the best. The specifics of this system are less important than the fundamental idea, which is that Chubb and Moe argue that there needs to be competition and market principles within education. And this idea has been an influential one in the UK education system. You can see the 1988 Education Reform Act, which standardised exams and introduced GCSEs and the national curriculum, and gave schools control over their own budget. So this meant that there was a standard by which schools could all be judged, so parents could make choices based on that. And it also meant that they financially operated somewhat more like a business than as an arm of the state. And the Conservative Prime Minister John Major in 1992 introduced Ofsted as well, which is the body that measures schools' performance and gives them a rating, which you could also argue once more gives parents that ability to shop around for schools and see which ones are the best performing. So in contemporary society, is this still how schools are working? How is the new right view of education and how it should function holding up? You can look to Wales in 2001, which abandoned league tables, which are a way of ranking schools. And Simon Burgess, a scholar, in 2011 found that children in Wales were underperforming by 2 GCSE grades a decade later, and he suggested that this was due to the scrapping of league tables and schools becoming less transparent about their results. In 2024, Ofsted scrapped their original standing way of rating schools, where they would give them a one-word rating, such as outstanding, good, poor, needs improvement, and this would be how schools were judged. And Ofsted announced that they were changing this to have a more holistic approach. And you could argue that Chubb and Moe would suggest that this reduces the kind of clear, accessible way that parents are able to judge schools. But you could also argue that it's a way that education has adapted to new right principles. Next, to have some evaluation of this idea, we can look at Miriam Davis, who in 1993 advocated for this approach put forth by Chubb and Moe. She said that it creates a parentocracy, which is where parents have more choice about where their children are educated, and she says that academic standards increase when parents have more choice. Scholars, of course, also criticise this. So Bohr in 1994, he says that yes, the new right has been very influential in education with processes like Ofsted in place, but he says that this advantages particularly middle class parents and perhaps disadvantages working class parents and students, because he says that those who really benefit from this increased choice are those that have the time and resources to make the most of this greater choice, time to visit schools and engage with Ofsted, etc. Whereas many working class families with less time and resources are not able to make as much use of the available resources. You could also criticise this view by suggesting that it assumes that everyone will act rationally. Just because there are league tables and Ofsted doesn't necessarily mean that parents or students will always make the right choice based on that, and it doesn't necessarily mean therefore that it will increase competition. You could also argue that the bureaucratic state parts of schools do not necessarily create low performance. It might be more about what the state is doing, not necessarily just the existence of bureaucracy and the existence of the state. And you could argue that by looking towards Scandinavian schools that are quite bureaucratic and have high organisation, but are high performing too. You could also argue that it's impossible for schools to ever truly act like markets. So this sort of emulation of the market is ineffective because schools will always be constrained by the fact that they, unless you want to fully privatise schools, will be a public funded institution, and they will be constrained by having compulsory curriculums and exams, etc., that limit their ability to act freely like a private organisation. So with this in mind, it's worth thinking about how this information will be useful later on in the course for commentaries on policies, and you can use some of these scholars and some of these criticisms to critique and support different views on marketisation, which is this process that the new right argue for within education. But also be careful if you have a question specifically on the new right perspectives on the role and function of education, that you don't allow that just to become an answer about policy and about marketisation, but you're focusing on those scholars specifically and their ideas rather than just the policies and the impact of the policies themselves. So there are some other new right arguments. So in addition to this kind of marketisation idea and the idea that schools should act as within the free market, new right scholars are also very clear that they think schools should transmit national culture. They believe that it should promote explicitly British values if you're in the UK, give students a positive idea of Britain's role in history, and they believe that the education system should still be designed to complete that role of secondary socialisation. You can see how this somehow manifested with the 2011 coalition government's introduction of the PREVENT strategy, which is an anti-extremism strategy that aims to promote fundamental British values within schools, which included things such as individual liberty and the rule of law. And this was introduced to the national curriculum in 2014. So this shows that new right thinking is sort of still having influence in education there and is still relevant in that way. But this is, of course, an idea that can also be criticised, with scholars arguing that the kind of imposition of an education system that perhaps has a somewhat warped perspective on British values and promotes Britishness above all else can alienate some students and be at risk of erasing diversity within our education system and society more broadly. And you could argue that as Britain becomes more diverse and more secular, using education to construct a sort of singular, narrow national identity could lead to greater fragmentation within society. So that is a run through of everything you need to know about new right perspectives on the role and function of education. If you found that helpful, go onto the Sociology Explained website and get hold of those notes along with all of the others. On there, you'll also be able to find, as I said in all the videos, essay plans, and in those essay plans, that will show you exactly how to apply this information to real A-level questions with all of the main paragraphs you need, introductions, conclusions, etc. So check that out if that sounds helpful.